It started as a murmur, just a low hum of fear that swept through the tight-knit community of Staten Island. You see, Staten Island is no stranger to tales of terror, but this was different. Parents began whispering about it at the bus stops, in grocery store aisles, and at the PTA meetings. The name Cropsey drifted through the air like a ghostly wind, sending shivers down the spines of anyone who dared to speak it. They say Cropsey was just an urban legend, a boogeyman conjured up to keep children from wandering too far from home. The story was always the same. A deranged man, once a janitor at the Willowbrook State School, who now stalks the streets at night, dragging away any child unlucky enough to cross his path. But that was just a story, right? A legend to scare kids straight, or so we thought. It was a late autumn evening when I first heard the name Cropsey. I was sitting in my living room, the windows open to let in the cool breeze, when the news came on. The anchorman's voice was serious, grave even, as he reported the disappearance of another child, the third in as many weeks. Each one vanished without a trace, snatched from their beds in the dead of night. The police had no leads, no suspects, just the whispers of Cropsey lurking in the shadows. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the trees outside sent my heart racing. I kept telling myself it was just an old legend, nothing more. But deep down something gnawed at me, something primal and cold. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, a growing dread that tightened with every passing hour. The next day I decided to dig deeper. I scoured the internet, looking for anything that might shed light on this Cropsey character. The deeper I went, the more unsettling the story became. Rumors of an old asylum on the outskirts of town, long abandoned, where Cropsey supposedly hid out. Some said he was still there, lurking in the ruins, waiting for his next victim. Others claimed he was more than just a man, something far darker and more twisted. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than just a ghost story. So, I did what any rational person would do. I drove out to Willowbrook. The road was empty, and the further I went, the more isolated I felt. The trees grew thicker, their branches intertwining like skeletal fingers, blocking out the waning daylight. By the time I reached the asylum, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving only a sickly orange glow on the edge of the sky. The building loomed before me, its windows shattered and boarded up, the walls covered in decades of grime and graffiti. But it wasn't the building that sent a chill down my spine, it was the silence. An oppressive, unnatural silence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I should have turned back right then and there, but something compelled me to go on. I parked the car and stepped out, the crunch of leaves underfoot the only sound in the stillness. The air was thick with decay, and as I approached the entrance, I could feel the weight of the place bearing down on me, a suffocating pressure that made it hard to breathe. The door was ajar, hanging off its hinges, inviting me in like some gaping maw. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to leave, but curiosity won out. I stepped inside, the darkness swallowing me whole. The smell hit me first, rot, mold, and something else, something metallic and sharp that made my stomach churn. I fumbled for my flashlight, the beam cutting through the thick blackness to reveal a corridor lined with peeling wallpaper and rusted wheelchairs. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional drip of water from the ceiling. I moved deeper into the asylum, my footsteps echoing in the empty halls. Every shadow seemed to twitch and move in the corner of my eye, and the deeper I went, the more I felt like I was being watched. I reached the main hall, a cavernous room with high ceilings and broken windows. In the center of the room, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A child's toy, a small, stuffed bear, matted and filthy, sat in the middle of the floor. It was out of place, like a piece of some forgotten puzzle. And as I approached, I could see something tied around its neck, a piece of twine, frayed and knotted. Suddenly, a noise behind me, a shuffling, scraping sound, made me whip around, my flashlight beam darting across the room. Nothing, just empty space. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I turned back to the toy, but it was gone. In its place, on the cold, cracked tiles, was a trail of fresh blood leading deeper into the darkness. And then I heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. The hairs on my arms stood up, and I knew without a doubt that I was not alone. I should have run, but my legs wouldn't move. The darkness seemed to close in around me, and for the first time, I understood the true terror behind the legend of Cropsey. There was something here, something ancient and evil, and it wasn't done with me yet. I don't know how I managed to drag myself out of that asylum that night. Every step I took felt like a battle against something unseen, something that wanted me to stay, to join the legion of lost souls that haunted those decrepit halls. But somehow I made it back to my car, my hands shaking so badly that it took several tries to get the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I tore down the overgrown road, the asylum shrinking in the rearview mirror until it was swallowed by the darkness. But I couldn't escape what I'd seen, what I'd felt. The image of that blood-stained trail burned into my mind, and that growl, the sound of something not quite human, echoed in my ears long after I reached the safety of my home. Sleep was a distant dream that night, chased away by every creak and groan of the house, every shadow that seemed to stretch just a little too long. The next morning, I was a wreck, unshaven, bloodshot eyes staring back at me from the bathroom mirror, but there was no time to dwell on it. The news was buzzing with reports of yet another missing child, a little girl named Emily, who'd disappeared from her bedroom in the middle of the night. The fourth child in a month. The police were stumped, the community in a state of panic, and in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was all connected, that the legend of Cropsey was no legend at all. I had to know more. I spent the day combing through old records, newspaper archives, anything that might give me a clue. The story of Willowbrook Asylum was well documented, a place where horrors had been committed in the name of care, a place where the most vulnerable were left to rot. But there was something more, something buried deeper, beneath the layers of dust and time. Late in the afternoon, I found it. An old yellowed article from the early 1970s, buried in the back pages of a local newspaper. It mentioned a man named Cyrus Krieger, a janitor at Willowbrook who had been committed after the asylum was shut down. According to the article, Krieger had been involved in a series of gruesome murders. Children, taken from the surrounding neighborhoods, their bodies mutilated and discarded like garbage. He'd been caught, tried, and sentenced to life in a high-security psychiatric facility. But there was one chilling detail that stood out. After his arrest, the disappearances stopped, for a time. But here was the kicker. The article hinted that Krieger had escaped, vanished into thin air before he could be transferred. There were no official records of this, of course, just rumors and whispers that he had returned to the ruins of Willowbrook, hiding out in the place that had been his home, his hunting ground. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but they formed a picture that I didn't want to see. If Krieger, if Cropsey, was real, then he was out there, somewhere, and the children who had vanished were just the latest victims in a nightmare that had never truly ended. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold, I made a decision. I had to go back. I had to know the truth, no matter how much it terrified me. I grabbed a flashlight, a crowbar, anything that might give me some sense of security, and headed back to Willowbrook. The drive felt longer this time, the road twisting and turning like a serpent, leading me back to the mouth of hell. By the time I reached the asylum, the sky was an inky black, the stars hidden behind a thick layer of clouds. The building loomed before me, a hulking silhouette against the night, and I could feel that same oppressive weight, that same suffocating dread pressing down on me. I stepped out of the car, the flashlight casting long, wavering shadows on the ground. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and I could hear the distant calls of nocturnal animals in the woods. But there was something else too, a sound just on the edge of hearing, like a faint whisper carried on the wind. It was a voice, or maybe several, speaking in hushed tones, too quiet to make out. I moved towards the entrance, the door still hanging off its hinges, creaking in the slight breeze. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but I pushed on, stepping into the darkness once more. The flashlight beam flickered, cutting through the gloom, revealing the same corridor I'd walked down the night before. But now it felt different, more alive, as if the very walls were watching me. I made my way deeper into the asylum, the silence broken only by the occasional drip of water, the rustle of something unseen in the shadows. I reached the main hall, the place where I'd found that child's toy, but now it was empty. No bear, no blood, just cold, empty space. And then, I heard it again. That growl, low and menacing, coming from somewhere behind me. I spun around, the flashlight darting across the room. But there was nothing there. Just darkness. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Suddenly there was a loud crash from somewhere deeper in the building, like a door being slammed shut. The sound reverberated through the halls, echoing in the vast emptiness. My grip tightened on the crowbar, my knuckles white as I moved towards the source of the noise. The corridor narrowed as I went, the walls closing in, the air growing colder with every step. I could feel my pulse in my throat, my skin prickling with fear as I reached a heavy metal door at the end of the hall. It was slightly ajar, the light from my flashlight glinting off the rusted surface. With a deep breath, I pushed the door open. It creaked on its hinges, revealing a small, windowless room. The smell hit me immediately, something rancid, something dead. I gagged, raising the flashlight to reveal the source of the stench. The room was filled with old medical equipment, rusted gurneys, broken IV stands, and in the center, a large metal table, stained with dark, dried blood. But that wasn't the worst of it. Lined up against the far wall were several small figures, their eyes wide and staring, their mouths open in silent screams. They were mannequins, dressed in tattered children's clothing, their plastic faces twisted into grotesque expressions of terror. And then the door slammed shut behind me. I whipped around, but before I could react, the flashlight was knocked from my hand, clattering to the floor. The room was plunged into darkness, and I could hear something moving, something scraping across the floor towards me. My breath caught in my throat, panic seizing me as I fumbled for the flashlight. The darkness was thick, suffocating, and I could feel something brushing against my leg, cold and clammy. I finally found the flashlight, my fingers trembling as I turned it on. The beam illuminated the room once more, but what I saw made my blood run cold. The mannequins had moved. They were closer now, their faces inches from mine, their eyes staring directly into mine. I screamed, swinging the crowbar wildly, but it passed through the air, hitting nothing. The mannequins were just that, plastic, lifeless. But something else was in the room with me, something alive. And then I felt it, a hand, cold and wet, wrapping around my ankle. I kicked out, breaking free, and bolted for the door. It wouldn't budge, stuck fast in its frame. I pounded on it, desperation clawing at my throat, but it was no use. I was trapped. And then the whispering began. It was all around me, filling the room with voices, low and sinister, speaking words I couldn't understand. My head spun, my vision blurring as the darkness seemed to close in. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a figure, tall and gaunt, standing in the shadows. Its face was obscured, but I could see the outline of a twisted grin, sharp and malevolent. Cropsey. I could feel its eyes on me, boring into my soul, and for the first time in my life, I knew true, unrelenting terror. My legs gave out and I fell to the floor, the world spinning around me, and then everything went black. When I regained consciousness, I was lying on the cold, hard floor, my body aching and my head pounding like a drum. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. Everything was a blur, a haze of darkness and pain. But then, the memories came flooding back, hitting me like a freight train. The asylum, the mannequins, the hand around my ankle, Cropsey. I sat up slowly, my head spinning, trying to make sense of my surroundings. The flashlight lay on the ground a few feet away, its beam still weakly illuminating the room. The mannequins were gone, but the room was still filled with that same overpowering stench of death and decay. I scrambled to my feet, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The door was still closed, but as I reached for the handle, it swung open with a loud creak. I hesitated, the fear gnawing at my insides like a hungry animal, but I had no choice. I had to get out of there. The corridor outside was dark, the only light coming from the flickering bulb overhead, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Every step I took echoed through the hall, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something, or someone, was following me. I moved as quietly as I could, trying to stay calm. But my heart was pounding so hard, I was sure it would give me away. The asylum was a labyrinth of corridors and rooms, each one more sinister than the last. And the deeper I went, the more lost I became. It was as if the building itself was alive, shifting and changing to keep me trapped within its bowels. Suddenly I heard it, a distant scream, high-pitched and filled with terror. It echoed through the halls, sending a jolt of fear through my body. I had no idea where it was coming from, but I knew I had to find it. Someone else was in here. Someone who might be in even worse danger than I was. I followed the sound, my heart racing, the corridors twisting and turning in impossible ways. The walls seemed to close in on me, the air growing colder with every step. The scream grew louder, more desperate, until finally I reached a door at the end of the hall. It was old and rotting, the wood splintered and peeling. I hesitated for just a moment before throwing it open, revealing a room lit by a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. The light flickered, casting long, jagged shadows on the walls, and in the center of the room, I saw her. A little girl, no more than 8 or 9 years old, huddled in the corner, her face pale and streaked with tears. Her clothes were torn, her hair matted with dirt, and her eyes, those wide, terrified eyes, looked up at me with a mix of hope and fear. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Please help me." My heart broke at the sight of her, and I rushed over, kneeling beside her. "It's okay," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm going to get you out of here." But as I reached out to take her hand, she recoiled, her eyes widening in fear. "He's coming," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He's coming for us." I froze, my blood turning to ice in my veins. "Who?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Cropsey," she breathed, her voice quivering with terror. "He took the others. He's going to take me too." My heart pounded in my chest as I glanced around the room, searching for any sign of the killer. But there was nothing, just shadows and the flickering light. I had to get her out of here, and fast. "Come on," I urged, taking her hand and pulling her to her feet. We need to go, now. She hesitated for a moment, but then nodded, her small hand gripping mine tightly. Together we moved towards the door, my eyes darting around the room, half expecting Cropsey to appear out of the darkness at any moment. We stepped out into the corridor, the air thick with tension, the silence oppressive. I could feel the girl's fear, could see it in her trembling hands and the way she kept glancing over her shoulder. Every shadow seemed to hide a monster. Every creak of the floorboard sent my heart racing. We moved quickly, trying to retrace my steps. But the asylum seemed different now, more twisted, more malevolent. The walls were stained with something dark and wet, and the air was thick with the scent of rot. It felt as if the building itself was alive, as if it was trying to keep us trapped within its walls. Suddenly the girl stopped, her eyes wide with terror. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I listened, straining to hear over the pounding of my own heart. And then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere deep within the asylum. It was slow, deliberate, like the sound of someone dragging something heavy across the floor. My blood ran cold. "We need to move," I whispered, pulling her along, but she was rooted to the spot, her eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. The tapping grew louder, closer, echoing through the halls like the ticking of some monstrous clock. I could feel the fear rising in my chest, threatening to choke me, but I forced myself to keep moving, to keep going. The girl stumbled beside me, her steps faltering, but I wouldn't let go of her hand. We had to get out. We turned a corner, the tapping now deafening, and there, standing at the end of the hall, was a figure. Tall and gaunt, its face obscured by shadows, but I could see the glint of something sharp in its hand, something that gleamed in the dim light. "Cropsey!" He stood there, silent and still, watching us with those cold, empty eyes. The air grew thick with the stench of blood and decay, and I could feel the walls closing in, trapping us in this nightmare. "Run!" I shouted, pushing the girl ahead of me, but my voice seemed to die in the air, swallowed by the darkness. She hesitated for a moment, but then bolted, her small figure disappearing into the shadows. I turned to follow, but before I could move, something cold and sharp sliced across my leg, sending a wave of pain shooting through my body. I stumbled, falling to the floor, my vision swimming as I tried to scramble to my feet. But Cropsey was there, looming over me, his twisted grin just visible in the darkness. I could see the glint of the blade in his hand, dripping with something dark and wet. I could feel the cold, clammy hand of fear gripping my heart, squeezing the life out of me. This was it. This was the end. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something. Movement in the shadows, something small and fast. The girl. She was running towards me, something in her hand glinting in the dim light. Before I could react, she threw herself at Cropsey, the object in her hand, a rusted piece of metal, plunging into his side. He let out a guttural snarl, staggering back as blood sprayed from the wound. "Go!" she screamed, her voice filled with desperation. "Run!" I didn't need to be told twice. I scrambled to my feet, the pain in my leg nearly unbearable, and bolted down the hall, the girl's screams echoing behind me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just ran, my heart pounding in my chest, the walls seeming to blur as I fled the nightmare that had consumed me. I don't know how I made it out of that place. The corridors twisted and turned, the shadows reaching out like clawed hands, trying to drag me back into the darkness. But somehow I found my way, stumbling out into the night, the cold air hitting me like a slap to the face. I collapsed on the ground outside, gasping for breath, my body shaking with exhaustion and fear. The asylum loomed behind me, dark and silent, as if nothing had happened at all. But I knew better. The horror I just witnessed was real, and it was far from over. I wish I could say that I never went back to Willowbrook, that I left that cursed place behind and never thought of it again. But the truth is, that night haunted me. Every waking moment, every time I closed my eyes, I could see Cropsey's twisted grin, hear the desperate screams of that little girl. I knew I had to go back, not because I wanted to, but because I had no choice. The nightmares wouldn't let me rest, wouldn't let me forget. Days passed in a blur of anxiety and dread. The police were still searching for the missing children, their efforts growing more desperate with each passing hour. But I knew the truth. I knew where they were, and I knew who had taken them. I spent those days preparing, gathering every bit of information I could, arming myself with anything that might help me survive another encounter with the monster that lurked in that asylum. I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself that Cropsey was just a man, a psychopath who'd escaped justice. But deep down, I knew there was something more. Something darker. The night I decided to go back, the sky was overcast, a thick blanket of clouds obscuring the moon. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. I drove in silence, the road ahead swallowed by darkness, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. When I reached Willowbrook, the sight of the asylum sent a shiver down my spine. It was just as I'd left it. Silent. looming, as if it had been waiting for my return. The trees around it stood like sentinels, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, the wind whispering through their leaves like a chorus of ghosts. I parked the car and stepped out, the cold air biting at my skin. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to leave this place behind and never look back. But I couldn't. Not after everything that had happened. I approached the entrance, the door still hanging off its hinges, creaking in the breeze. The flashlight in my hand cast long, wavering shadows on the walls as I stepped inside, the familiar smell of decay and rot assaulting my senses. The asylum was just as I remembered it. Dark, oppressive, filled with an unnatural silence that seemed to swallow every sound. I made my way through the corridors, my heart pounding in my chest, every step echoing through the empty halls. I didn't know what I was looking for. Answers, closure, maybe just a way to make the nightmare stop. But as I moved deeper into the asylum, I felt the weight of something pressing down on me, a growing sense of dread that I couldn't shake. And then I heard it, a faint rhythmic tapping, just like before, coming from somewhere deep within the building. My heart skipped a beat, fear coursing through my veins, but I forced myself to keep moving, following the sound. The corridor seemed to stretch on forever, the walls narrowing as I went, the air growing colder with every step. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, until finally, I reached a door at the end of the hall. It was the same door as before, old and rotting, the wood splintered and peeling. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the handle. This was it. Whatever was behind that door, it was the key to everything. The truth, the end of this nightmare. With a deep breath, I pushed the door open. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of my flashlight. It was empty, save for a single figure standing in the center of the room. The girl! She was facing away from me, her small frame hunched over, her shoulders shaking as if she were crying. "Hey," I called out softly, stepping into the room. "It's okay. I'm here to help." She didn't respond, didn't move. I took another step closer, my heart pounding in my chest. "It's okay," I repeated, my voice trembling. "You're safe now." Suddenly she turned to face me and I froze, my blood turning to ice. Her face. It wasn't the face of the girl I'd seen before. It was twisted, contorted into a grotesque mask of rage and pain. Her eyes dark and empty, her mouth stretched into a wide, unnatural grin. Before I could react, she lunged at me, her small hands gripping my throat with a strength that shouldn't have been possible. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight as I struggled to break free, but her grip was iron, her eyes boring into mine with a hatred that made my skin crawl. "Cropsey," she hissed, her voice a guttural snarl that sent a shiver down my spine. "He's here." With a final burst of strength, I managed to throw her off, sending her crashing to the floor. I gasped for breath, my heart racing. But before I could recover, the door slammed shut behind me, plunging the room into darkness. I scrambled for the flashlight, my hands shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But when I turned it on, the room was empty. The girl was gone, vanished into thin air. The only sound was the faint tapping, now coming from somewhere behind me. Slowly I turned, the flashlight beam trembling as it illuminated the wall behind me. And there, etched into the wall in deep, jagged letters, was a single word: Cropsey. The letters dripped with something dark and wet. Blood, fresh and glistening in the dim light. My heart pounded in my chest, panic rising as the tapping grew louder, more insistent. And then I saw it. A figure, tall and gaunt, standing in the shadows, its eyes glowing in the darkness. Cropsey. His face was twisted into a grotesque grin, his hands stained with blood, his body covered in deep, ragged wounds. But it wasn't the wounds that terrified me. It was the fact that he was still moving, still coming for me. I backed away, the flashlight beam flickering as I tried to find a way out, but the door was gone, the walls closing in around me. There was no escape, no way out of this nightmare. I was trapped. Cropsey moved closer, his twisted grin widening as he reached out for me. I could feel the cold, clammy hand of fear gripping my heart, squeezing the life out of me as I backed into the corner, my back against the wall. And then, in a flash of realization, it all came together. The missing children, the girl, the twisted horror that was Cropsey. They weren't victims. They were him. They were all parts of him, fragments of his shattered soul, bound together in this place of nightmares. Cropsey wasn't just a man. He was a force, a darkness that consumed everything it touched, twisting it into something monstrous. And now he was coming for me. I screamed, the sound echoing through the room as Cropsey lunged at me, his hands outstretched, his twisted grin filling my vision. I felt his cold, clammy fingers wrap around my throat, the pressure building as the darkness closed in around me. And then everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying on the ground outside the asylum, the cold morning air stinging my skin. The building loomed above me, silent and dark, as if nothing had happened at all. But I knew better. The horror I just experienced was real. and it would haunt me for the rest of my life. I stumbled to my feet, my body aching, my mind a blur of fear and confusion. I didn't know how I'd gotten out, didn't know why I was still alive. But as I looked up at the asylum, I knew one thing for certain. Cropsey was still in there, waiting, watching. And as long as that place stood, as long as the darkness remained, he would never stop. I turned and walked away, the weight of what I'd seen pressing down on me like a lead blanket. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The nightmares would follow me for the rest of my days. But I knew one thing. I would never ever return to Willowbrook. The end.